Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today, we're going to have a discussion of the highly pathogenic avian influenza response in Tennessee in 2017 by Dr. Sean Bolton. Sean, I'd like to turn it over to you to give it an introduction of yourself and tell us about the topic.
Hey, good morning. Been asked to provide an overview of the 3D aspects of our incident here in Tennessee, and I'll also touch on some of the premises that were involved in Alabama as well. I am the emergency coordinator here in Tennessee, also serve as operations chief on the Red Incident Management Team for VS, and deployed numerous times to the 2015 incident, and as a result of that, did a lot of planning and preparation with our industry and stakeholders and state veterinarian here in Tennessee during the latter part of 2015 and 2016. And as luck would have it, we ended up having high path in Tennessee, and so this will be a little bit about what happened, what we did, our planning process, and primarily some of the lessons learned from that incident. So with that, I'll just go ahead and get into the presentation. I do want to give some credit for some of the slides content to Dr. Charlie Hatcher, who's our state veterinarian here in Tennessee. He gave a somewhat similar lessons learned presentation to the U.S. Poultry and Egg Association back during the summer, and some of his slide content I've utilized as well as some of my own. So moving on into the presentation, planning. Our industry in Tennessee is diverse, but concentrated heavily in primary breeders and production of genetics. And at the end of 2015, we met with our industry, our ag commissioner here in Tennessee, state veterinarian, USDA, assistant director, emergency coordinators, and really sat down and thought about what we needed to do here in our state to protect our industry. And even though we had never had a case of highly pathogenic avian influenza in the state of Tennessee, we set as a goal that we were going to plan in 2015 and 2016 like we were going to have an outbreak. Our goal was to build as competent a team as we possibly could, and also to address self-sufficiency to the point that we could. Just having come through 2015, and all of you were involved in that in some way or another, and remember the times where we only had 4 VS IMTs and 3 were deployed at one time, and 1 was barely rested, and so from the state side, our state veterinarian wanted to work with me to establish a plan to where we could be self-sufficient in terms of a fairly large-scale outbreak in Tennessee if resources in terms of IMTs from VS were not going to be available to assist us. Our poultry industry in Tennessee, in terms of numbers, is not as large as many states, but the value of our poultry industry is significant. We have the top 3 primary breeders in the world have complexes, numerous complexes in Tennessee, and the genetic impact of their business is that they affect the genetics of approximately 95+% of the poultry produced in the world. So there is a lot of value in terms of genetics, great-grandparent flocks hidden away in the hills of Tennessee, and northern Alabama that we planned as best we could to protect. We assembled what we called the AI task force in Tennessee late in 2015 and early 2016, which was a combination of several agencies, Tennessee Department of Agriculture, USDA, APHIS, Wildlife Services, Tennessee Emergency Management Agency, Tennessee Department of Health, and state wildlife agencies, and probably some others. But we began to meet on a monthly basis to determine the roles and the responsibilities of each agency in the case of a highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak in Tennessee. There were numerous action items that were assigned to various agencies. And on the agriculture side, in addition to developing an incident management team, we developed carbon sources for composting, identified water sources for foam depopulation across the state, worked with area county emergency managers to be able to locate those things and be ready, especially in the areas of the state where we have significant commercial poultry operations. On the agriculture side, our role was to develop a competent multi-agency incident management team. And we had as a goal for especially our operations section was to try to preserve as many of our animal health field staff, our VMOs, our AHTs, both state and federal, to use as our branch directors, our team leads, our group supervisors, team members in the various operations groups and teams within, especially the disease management branch. We had approximately 30 or so that fall into that category, mostly AHTs, but we have about 6 field VMOs as well, both on the state and the federal side. Where we knew that we were lacking was to be able to put personnel in the field to accomplish surveillance. So we developed a volunteer program where we solicited the help of our forestry division, which falls under the Tennessee Department of Agriculture, and we also asked for the help of our University of Tennessee Agriculture Extension Service. And through that, we had approximately, from those two systems, 100 volunteers that would assist agriculture. And because of that, we developed some training programs for them. We held those in 4 locations around the state and trained those volunteers in operations, ICS organization, safety, donning, doffing of PPE, site management, and surveillance sampling of birds. So we felt like with some of our animal health as team leads and group supervisors that we could use these volunteers effectively to do what we needed to do in terms of site management, surveillance sampling, and so on. The net result of that was that we would be able to put about 150 people into a response for AI in our state, and many of our positions in the IMT, especially in the planning and logistics sections, were staffed by forestry personnel, as well as our emergency management agency personnel, so we could utilize the talents and experience of our animal health personnel. So we'll move on to what actually happened. You should see a slide that is a map of the major North American flyways. And if you look at the green Mississippi flyway and the blue Atlantic flyway, there's a point there in northern Florida where they diverge, and the middle and eastern part of Tennessee, the state of Georgia, and state of Alabama largely aren't included in the major flyway paths. That happens to be exactly where we had the disease. So the first lesson learned is even though you're not in a flyway, doesn't mean that you're not going to have avian influenza virus shed by migrating waterfowl in your area. A little on the incident epidemiology. In retrospect, looking back at what happened, there was about a 175-mile wide path running through Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Georgia. And we estimated, based on when the incident began, that probably second or third week of February is when the waterfowl were shedding this North American H7N9 virus that we eventually dealt with. As a result of that, there were multifocal pinpoint introductions on farms, which were then carried into the barns. Exclusively, the commercial operations that were affected were all egg layers, hens of some age, and we did not have any broilers that were affected, even though the state of Georgia, the state of Alabama, each have over 1 billion broilers on feed or annual production. And in one case, we had a broiler farm that had something like 150,000 plus that was directly across the street within a few hundred yards of one of the high path premises that never did get infected. So for whatever reason, the older birds certainly seem to be affected more, whether that's age dependent or biosecurity or management of those layer operations provides a little more vulnerability. In this case, we did not have anything other than our commercial layers that were affected. In Tennessee, we had 3 commercial operations, 2 that were high path AI premises, and then 1 that was a low path avian influenza premises. We also had 2 backyard flocks in Tennessee that were infected with with low path avian influenza as well. Throughout the incident, both in Tennessee and Alabama, the only 2 high path premises were in Lincoln County, Tennessee, and within a mile of each other. Everything else that I might mention, whether Tennessee, Alabama, or Georgia, all of the rest of those were low path AI. There was no evidence of lateral transfer between the premises except the 2 high path locations. It was approximately 10 days apart. And we had 2 backyard flocks that were in the high path control zone that were detected with low path H7N9. They never were clinical, although they were shedding virus. In the case of those 2 backyard flocks, we did not depopulate them. The owners preferred not to. We did some serology about a week after the initial positive PCRs and found that they had mounted a nice consistent antibody response. Then we PCR'd those again once a week for the next few weeks, and they did clear the virus and went negative and were released when the control zone was originally released, the high path control zone. So the first case was a positive PCR H7 at CE Cord Lab, which is our known lab, state diagnostic lab here in Tennessee. 74,000 broiler breeders. You can see the ages there. That was on Friday. Sent samples to NVSL for confirmation, and confirmation on the following day, on Saturday, March 4th, for H7 high path AI. We started depopulation on that day, Saturday, March the 4th, and depopulation was completed within 24 hours, ended sometime Sunday. The only one of the 8 houses on this particular site was affected, and the onset of clinical signs was relatively rapid. And by the time the FAD investigation was conducted, there was a rapid spike in mortality. Lesson learned there that we all know is that high path doesn't sneak up on you. It's pretty obvious when you've got HPAI. So we finished that depopulation on Sunday, and I'll talk more about the specifics of that. On Monday the 6th, one of our primary breeders from our one of the largest genetics company in Tennessee began surveillance and found a grandparent stock flock that was positive, again, at our non-lab here in Tennessee. Monday, March 6th, 16,500 broiler breeder, but a primary breeder, GP flock in the adjacent county to the east was detected positive H7 PCR at our non-lab. Samples were forwarded to NVSL, and NVSL confirmed the H7 on March the 8th. However, because this was a primary breeder, the company did not want to wait for NVSL to confirm, even though clinically it looked like low path, and eventually it was confirmed as low path. There's zero tolerance for that primary breeder for any type of AI, so they depopulated the flock prior to confirmation. They were not seeking indemnity, and were focused on preserving the health status of their system. NVSL verified that the H7N9 low path virus in Giles County was closely related to the high path virus in Lincoln County, and again, those are adjacent counties. Those two premises approximately 30 miles apart. And then the third commercial flock in Tennessee was approximately 10 days after the first, 55,000 broiler breeders, 29 weeks old, in the high path control zone. So they were being tested regularly for egg movement as part of our surveillance that was going on within the control zone. On the 13th of March, we found 1 out of 18 that were PCR, that popped a PCR, sent to NVSL for confirmation, and was negative. And this just is an example or a lesson learned that how quickly things can change. The following day after that surveillance was done with negative results, including virus isolation, there was a spike in increase in mortality, 300 to 400 dead within the next 24 hours. Did an FAD investigation, and the end result was that this particular premises was positive for high path as well. Approximately 1 mile to the north of the original premises. So here's a map showing Tennessee, southern middle Tennessee, a large portion of northern central Alabama, and just a sliver of Georgia on the right side of that screen. The purple 10K circle is our high path control zone. 2 red stars there that are showing the location of the 2 high path premises. There were 3 backyard flocks within that high path control zone, 2 in Tennessee, 1 in Alabama. And then in Tennessee, the green circle is the first primary breeder that was infected with low path H7N9. So that is a surveillance zone, 10K. And just to the south of that premises in Alabama was another commercial premises that was diagnosed shortly thereafter, again low path, and this was also a primary breeder of the same company. To go back to the high path premises, we'll just to detail a little bit on depopulation and disposal methods. Both of the high path premises were depopulated by foam. In the first premises, the company actually owned a foamer and brought that to the site with their personnel. And the way the barns were laid out on that particular site, there was a group of barns kind of in the front of the premises, and then another group of barns in the rear of the premises. And the group of barns in the rear of the premises contained the barn that had the clinically the birds with clinical signs. Everything else was clinically normal. So the company volunteered or preferred to depopulate the barns that had no clinical signs, and then we also deployed through National Veterinary Stockpile. Fortunately for us, there were 4 foaming units that were staged in Memphis, Tennessee at a Clean Harbors facility, approximately 4-hour drive, no more than that, away from this premises. And so NVS deployed those foamers at our request and contractors to go with them to this premises, and they foam depopulated the group of barns in the back of the premises. The company felt like they could get their personnel and their equipment in and out, do the depopulation in those unaffected, or at least clinically unaffected barns, and get their people and equipment back off of that premises, C&D'd and with less risk. So we could see the logic of that plan and went forth with it. Disposal in this premises was by burial, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. The second high-path premises that was approximately 10 days later also was depopulated by foam. In this particular case, the company and both of these high-path prims were commercial broiler breeders owned by the same company. And so in the second case, the company, being concerned that we might be in an expanding incident, preferred not to put their personnel on site, because they were bringing these people from other poultry complexes in the area to assist in depopulation. So in this second system, they preferred that we do all of that ourselves. So we deployed the same group of contractors from NVS and the 4 foamers for that complex, and depopulated those barns by foam. Now to shift over to the low path prims, the primary breeder, these barns again were depopulated. They were depopulated by the company. We provided some oversight, but they had their own crews, and were focused on speed. And so they had cervical dislocation crews that came in with just within a few hours of the lab result, and did both of those barns, approximately 8,000 head each, and also buried for disposal. Shortly after that, as the industry in the area became aware of what was going on, there were a lot of both commercial and primary breeders that did surveillance, sort of a self-imposed surveillance on their own. And so over the course of a few days, the other low path prims in Alabama were identified. One outside of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which is in the far south and west corner of that particular map. One identified in Georgia. And then the premises that you see right in the middle of Alabama was a commercial broiler breeder that was identified. It was the last premises, and probably the one that instilled a lot of anxiety. If you look at that particular premises on a satellite view, that is one of the densest poultry production areas in this country. And so within that 10K were literally dozens of broiler breeders as well as broiler sites, and that particular area of Alabama is very high density of poultry. Fortunately, that premises was the only one. After 3 weeks of surveillance were done, we did not identify any additional premises, and felt quite fortunate at the end of that one. to have escaped without any spread. So if you're not familiar with what a broiler breeder house looks like in the Southeast, this is, as we talk about foam depopulation or even composting, this kind of give you an idea of what these houses look like. There's a scratch area in the middle of the barn, slats on either side with nest boxes on either side. And so as you plan for foam depopulation, you can either foam the entire barn, which uses a lot of water and a lot of foam, or you can move all the birds to the scratch area, pin them, push them to one end of the house and foam them, which works better, uses less foam, uses a lot less water, but you have to move the birds. And movement of birds, especially sick birds and especially older birds, always presents its own set of problems. Another picture of a broiler breeder house, birds removed. You can kind of see how the slats are been removed from the left side of that picture and placed on top of the slats on the right. Dirt scratch area in the middle. In Tennessee, our broiler breeders typically look like this. Our primary breeders of our genetics companies are concrete floor as opposed to dirt floor. But that just gives you a general idea of what these houses look like, and you can appreciate what some of the challenges might be, both in foam depopulation or in in-house composting. So a few of the lessons learned, and as we all know, rapid detection, notification, depopulation is critical in at least in the Tennessee premises. We were able to achieve that goal of depopulation within 24 hours with foam. We were greatly assisted by NVS being able to deploy and put equipment and contractors on site in a very reasonable amount of time. We had done our homework in terms of water sourcing, so that was not a problem for us at all. We knew where the water was. We knew the people with the volunteer fire department that could provide us with the water. And so that went smoothly, and oftentimes it does not. Another lesson learned for me personally was in terms of statement of work on the contractors for depopulation on the first high path premises. Within, once the realization sets in that you've got high path in your state and you're going to respond, we get focused on that 24-hour goal for depopulation, and we move forward as fast as we can to get that done, and rightly so. Lesson learned for me is you need to be thinking about the next day and the next day. And so when when NVS deployed Clean Harbors over with the foam units, we had a clear-cut understanding on the first ICG call with NVS that they were coming, personnel would be provided, operate the foamers, depopulate the birds, pin the birds, provide pinning supplies and materials, and they did a good job. Following day, however, as we started contemplating the transition into the disposal phase, we had numerous dead birds that were on the slats that needed to be hand carried and moved to the scratch area so we could access them with skid steers and start disposal. And we had 30 contractors on site who were not authorized through the current contract to pick up a bird that they moved the day before during depopulation, but now that they were dead, they could not move them to the scratch area for us. So very thankful to Rodney White and Lisa Brown for working with me and doing contract modification on the fly so that we could retain that same crew of people who were still on site to do some pre-disposal hand labor force. But having a very well thought out statement of work and also a copy of the contract in hand for the COR on site to be able to utilize as they work with contractors is extremely important. Another lesson learned, handling birds is almost always a problem. And it's good to have our animal health staff trained to move birds if we can. It is also extremely important to work with the poultry company and the grower and use their assistance and knowledge in moving birds prior to foam depopulation. It's probably 4 times as much time spent in moving birds and pinning birds as there is in actually generating the foam. So as you push for that 24-hour goal, movement of birds, especially sick birds and older birds, is always an issue. For these broiler breeder houses, were we to do this over again, and as we plan for the future, I think CO2 is something that we need to consider in some of these houses, and hope to look at that in more detail in the future. And some of the work that Scott and others have done with whole house CO2, I think would work well in these broiler breeder houses where we have nest boxes and slats and things that are obstacles to foaming. For disposal, we did not have approved landfills or landfills that were interested in taking birds. Incineration was not a readily available option. So we knew that we were going to burial compost, preferably in-house. These 3 premises in Tennessee chose burial, I think primarily in the interest of time as much as anything else. There were some issues with burial. Approval is one. We worked with Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, USDA, NRCS. We worked with University of Tennessee, Ag Extension, environmental soil specialists for advice in making assessments of burial sites. But ultimately, the approval for that will fall on the state veterinarian, at least in the state of Tennessee. And so Dr. Hatcher reluctantly, but he did approve burial sites. And generally it went relatively well. We had we had a heavy rainstorm after the pit was dug, some things like that. But in retrospect, I certainly think Dr. Hatcher's opinion and mine as well, we'd prefer to compost in-house. We don't like the thought process behind transporting infected carcasses to landfill. And we are currently meeting with our industry to have them communicate with us for each commercial premises what their plans are for depopulation, disposal, C&D, and I'll touch on that a little bit more in a minute. Additionally, what we came to refer to as the 90-day rule is that for OIE declaration of high path free status, that occurs 90 days after the last building on the last premises is cleaned and disinfected. So this came into play, and I'll discuss that more on the next slide. Cleaning and disinfection. The methods chosen were varied. With our commercial broiler breeder farms, they chose wet cleaning of slats, moved the wooden slats outside, power washed those, dry cleaned in the house, did some wet cleaning in the house as well. They did look at dry cleaning with heat, which is what we had suggested, but gave them the right to choose. And in retrospect, I think for time saving, they probably would have chosen dry cleaning with heat, but felt that it was, in terms of expense, it's going to be easier to wet clean. Takes a long time regardless of whatever method you choose for C&D. In our primary breeders, our genetics companies with concrete floors, in the interest of preservation of their health status, they chose a variety of methods for C&D. In each one of those primary breeder houses, they dry cleaned, they heated, then they wet cleaned and used a chemical disinfectant. And then at the end, they formaldehyde fumigated those barns. So they kind of did a triple dose in the primary breeders, where the broiler breeders used wet cleaning, typical C&D, Virkon disinfectant. In all cases, when we got around to environmental sampling stage, they all passed virus isolation, and even in the primary breeders where they used multiple means of C&D, they were still PCR detected and had to go to virus isolation. So ultimately, using environmental sampling, virus isolation negative as a litmus test for the effectiveness of C&D is why we do that. Our high path prims, obviously, we follow a very specific roadmap, and in low path, it kind of falls back to the state plan as to what we'll do, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. So we get into some of the lessons learned. And this first one falls outside of the kind of the 3D aspect of this presentation, but just one that I wanted to mention is that the permitting gateway in EMERS worked fantastic. We had numerous commercial companies that bought into this early on with some training that Shelley Phillips and others had done. And we had some of that information in EMRS, but as a result of this incident, our poultry industry has seen the light on going ahead and getting premises in EMERS, and I think with the exception of maybe only one small commercial company in Tennessee, we now have everything preloaded into EMRS. As I mentioned early on, our primary breeding industry, our genetics, is the value of the poultry industry in Tennessee. We do have two large broiler complexes, one in Middle Tennessee and one in East Tennessee. But the value of our industry lies heavily in the production of genetics. Our high path premises, because they knew they were not going to be able to restock until the fall, when they would have eventually been scheduled to receive birds or a new flock, wanted to take some time on the C&D phase of this, and the grower wanted to do much of the work himself. But as we began to consider exports and what would be required for AI-free declaration to go to OIE, it became evident that C&D of all premises had to be complete before that 90-day clock could start. So in this particular case, we had the primary breeder industry looking at the broiler industry and the pace of C&D at the high path premises, costing our primary breeders some significant dollars in their ability to resume exports. And proud of the way our industry handled that, and that they cooperated. They threw additional resources at these broiler breeder farms and sped up that pace of C&D so we could get that declaration to OIE and get our primary breeders back in the business of exporting genetics. More lessons learned. High path versus low path was a big curveball in this incident in terms of response. Certainly, as I mentioned before, high path doesn't sneak up on you. It's very obvious. Another lesson learned in low path is that these flocks certainly will clear virus. We can talk about controlled marketing, which wasn't an option for us because we didn't have slaughtered plants in the area that would take them, but that's certainly an option to depopulation if that avenue exists. In the case of high path response, we certainly know exactly what we have to do and how we have to do it, what's approved, what the time frames are. Low path response is dependent upon state response plan. And one of the eye openers in this incident was that state plans for Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, and almost every state in the country, I would imagine, assume that low path H5, H7 would be eligible for indemnity, and that is not the case. Low path is evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and at this time, the criteria for how those cases would be evaluated and whether or not indemnity would be paid was not well defined. And so the state veterinarians, the industry, and APHIS met in August this year, I think as a direct result of this incident, to develop some guidance for that. And there's now a decision matrix out, which really ranks a low path premises on a low versus high risk basis as to whether or not that premises might be eligible for indemnity. Collaboration and communication in terms of a lesson learned. A lot of the planning that we did on the front end paid off in a major way. We accumulated all the agencies listed there in our AI task force. And additionally, now we have convened our poultry industry and our State Department of Agriculture, State Veterinarian Commissioner of Agriculture, as well as USDA Veterinary Services Assistant Director, myself as an emergency coordinator, some of our VMOs, in a avian health advisory board that we're starting to meet regularly. And as a result of that, each of our poultry companies has agreed to plan with us to develop and maintain specific biosecurity plans under NPIP for their premises, which we will audit, that they have agreed to share with us their chosen method for, or their preferred method for depopulation in each of their premises, their preferred method of disposal and C&D. All of that will be shared with us, and additionally, any premise data that's not in EMRS will be shared as well. And so we will know going forward for every premises in the state, commercial premises, exactly what their plan is, and if and many of them indicate they'll go with in-house composting for disposal if there's a next go-around. Any of those that may choose or specify burial as their preferred disposal method, their site will go in before a panel of subject matter experts that Dr. Hatcher has assembled. And that primarily is our Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, our University of Tennessee Ag Extension, environmental soil specialists, and USDA NRCS. All of those have provided individuals to serve as SMEs, and so that that burial site will need to be approved in advance and recommendation made by that panel to the state veterinarian as to whether or not that is a suitable burial site. We continue to meet with our AI task force, our Avian Health Advisory Board, and continue to work on improving our incident management team here in Tennessee. We were fortunate because of the 2015 incident that we had a number of experienced individuals serving in key roles in our incident management team. We had operations section chief from the red team. We had a former planning section chief from the blue team. We had the current logistics chief from the gold team. We had the current finance admin section chief from the blue team, as well as the safety officer from the blue team. So we had a lot of people in key positions that had experience and were trained in the new procedures and processes that have been developed since 2015. We also had the opportunity to send numerous of our field employees to courses such as the Case Management Group Supervisor course, Delaware Depopulation and Disposal course. And so we had a good core group of animal health people that were the foundation of our incident management team, and then led by our state veterinarian and our assistant director here in Tennessee as incident commanders in a unified command. We felt like we put forth a respectable response and achieved most of the goals, not without problems here and there, but ultimately, if someone had told me that we would have high-path AI in Tennessee and there would only be 2 premises, I would have taken that deal from the start. That concludes what I had prepared to present. I'll be glad to answer questions if anyone has any.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bolton, for that excellent presentation. So does anybody have questions? Well, I can start with a couple. So one of my first question is that why was burial chosen over composting? Was it just unfamiliarity with the composting process? Did it sound too complicated? What do you think was the reasoning behind that?
2 things, I think, Lori. One was a perception of time. I think they felt the producer in the company felt, or the grower in the company felt that burial would be quicker, and I guess in a way it is. But also, I think there is a perception among these broiler breeder layer type houses, like I showed pictures of. And I know Gary Flory and others have done some work on in-house composting, and that it can be done in these buildings that sometimes have low ceilings and sometimes have concrete runners that would make composting in-house and especially operation of a skid steer somewhat difficult. But I think Gary's work and others have shown that it can be done. So I think that perception steered them away from composting. However, in retrospect, I think many of them now, as a direct result of this incident, are strongly considering that. So I'm really looking forward to our Avian Health Advisory Board receiving all of the site-specific information that I just mentioned to you, and what their disposal plans are going to be, and see, what percentage of our industry perhaps is now bought into in-house composting as a effective method of disposal. I think certainly for me, that's my preference. I think for Dr. Hatcher, the liability that goes along with approving a burial site, as you all know better than I do, is tremendous. And so I think he is reluctant to approve burial sites unless there's just not much of a choice. And so in-house composting, even out of the house composting, if it's a viable option, I think we'll strongly consider in the future, and I think our industry is going to buy into that as well.
Thank you for that. Now, I have another question regarding the CO2. You indicated that it's likely that folks would consider that rather than foam in the future. Is that because it was of the challenges with moving the birds and the CO2 doesn't require that, or what's the reasoning?
That is exactly it. In the houses, where you have those all the slats and the nest boxes and all the equipment that's inside a broiler breeder house, just to be able to seal that building and CO2 it would be really quick and easy. But you're still going to have bird movement regardless, because live bird movement versus dead bird movement. So it's probably easier on the front end to achieve that 24-hour goal if you're pushed for time, in my mind, to seal that house and CO2 it and get the birds down as fast as possible, regardless of which method you choose, whether it's CO2 or foam. In these broiler breeder houses, there's going to be some hand labor involved in that, either prior to depopulation with foam or post depopulation with CO2.
Thank you. I have one more question regarding the dry cleaning. So you indicated that that's your preference, to do the dry cleaning and then heat, and that sounds like a really great approach. I'm just wondering if you've had any challenges with the dry cleaning and producing particles. So, dusty conditions that could potentially spread virus. What is your thinking on that? And of course, there would be dry cleaning, whether you're doing a wet cleaning method eventually or not. But I was just wondering what your experience was with the dry cleaning step.
Don't really have much of an opinion on that, but the majority of my experience with dry cleaning would have come out of 2015 in Iowa. But in this particular case, with our incident, we only had one facility in Tennessee that dry cleaned and heated, and so my personal opinion is I do not think with achieving temperatures that we want to achieve with heating and dry cleaning and heat, that this virus lives very long. And so with ventilation systems turned off in a sealed building, I don't worry much about spreading virus, but it's certainly, during that dry cleaning phase, something to consider.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions for Dr. Bolton?
Hi, Sean. This is Doris Olander, VS, Wisconsin. And we trialed in Iowa an incinerator that worked quite well. So Lori knows quite a bit about it. Lisa Brown knows quite a bit about it. And that may be of interest as well.
Thank you, Doris. Yeah, there were numerous types of incinerators that we used in Iowa, and I forgot the green eggs.
Those didn't work.
Yeah, and then there was the large ones that we had, but anyway, yeah. We never really considered incineration in this case.
I'll send you a report on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if I can follow up on Doris's comment that the unit that she observed in the field and wrote the excellent report on was something that the contractor had developed after 2015, when they had so much trouble with those green egg incinerators and the larger units. And so this is resolves a lot of the problems they had with those two options and comes up with a much better solution. Yeah, I definitely suggest taking a look at Doris's report.
Is that the hurricane?
Yep.
Yeah, I've got that. I've got the information on the hurricane. Yeah, we were aware of that, and what I've read about it indicates that it works well. I think the perception was that again, Beryl was going to be quick and easy, and it didn't necessarily play out that way. But we certainly have that hurricane in our minds as in the arsenal for the future.
Thank you. I see we have a couple questions come in on the chat, written questions. One of them is outdoor composting considered too risky? Is that justified? And that's from Steve Goff.
Thank you, Steve. That's
So well, I have my opinion.
I'll probably let you answer the question since you're the disposal expert. But I mean, certainly I would prefer to stay in the house, obviously, for biosecurity reasons. With that said, I'll just let you give your opinion on what you think.
And so my opinion on that is that the outdoor composting is the windrows are constructed slightly different than the indoor composting. So whereas indoor they might put 10 to 12 inches of carbon source underneath the birds and then another 8 to 12 inches on top of the birds, when it's outdoor composting, those layers are about twice as thick. So they're talking more like in the range of 18 to 24 inches of a base layer and 24 inches of a cap. And that thicker cap serves a number of purposes. One is that it contains odors much better than the thinner cap. And so fewer odors means less attraction of vectors and scavengers and so forth. Plus, the thicker layer also helps insulate the piles from various weather conditions. So snow and whatnot, that insulating layer will enable the pile to heat up internally and not be as affected by external weather conditions. So given that the cap is twice as thick, I would argue that it also prevents transport of airborne particles that might be associated with a live virus. But I'm not sure if there is any scientific data to justify a preference for indoor composting versus outdoor composting. I can look into that for you.
One comment I do want to make, in case I did not make it during the presentation, is that goes back to that OIE declaration in the 90 days. I know for our industry in Tennessee, and this might be different for other states, but since our industry is so genetically primary breeder, export oriented, the rule, as I understand it, is that after cleaning and disinfection is complete in the last premises, last building, that 90-day clock will start. But in the 2015 incident, at least at that time, and may not be the same now and may not be defined now, but at least in that incident, if I recall correctly, that 90-day clock could start for freeze status with the capping of the last compost pile. And if that currently in any future outbreak still is the same rule, I think our industry would strongly consider composting in that case, just in the interest of time, because they can they can depop in windrow and cap a compost pile and start the clock very quickly.
Thank you. One more question. This looks like it's from Kyle Somke. Is the post-depop labor issue on moving bird carcasses resolved with the contractors now for future incidents? They had issues with that in Minnesota High Path AI 2015 on the front end also. Wouldn't touch live birds or dead birds in those instances.
Good question, Kyle. I'll tell you what I have done is that after this incident, we worked with National Veterinary Stockpile to have a tabletop exercise in Tennessee in July this past summer, shortly after the incident. And while the issues were fresh on our mind, and I give a lot of credit to the staff at NVS for putting together a really good exercise for us, VS, Tennessee Department of Agriculture, Tennessee Emergency Management Agency, and our public health agencies primarily were represented there, because we took the exercise to the next level, including dissemination of vaccine for public health reasons and so on. But as part of that call, I did give them a very candid, clear-cut feedback on those very issues, and expressed to them that in the heat of the moment, especially in the first premises, that when there is a rush to mobilize the incident management team, when there's a rush to mobilize operations and get people on the premises and achieve this 24-hour depopulation goal, that we may not be thinking through a statement of work, line by line, and addressing every single issue that we need a contractor to be able to perform. And so I've asked them very specifically to think through that for us, maybe to come up with some templates to prompt us with questions, and not put the responsibility necessarily on us to think through every aspect of that statement of work. So I'm hoping that, since it was a problem before in Minnesota, since it was a problem for us in Tennessee, that those of us who serve as ops chiefs and IMTs and people with NVS like Rodney and Lisa and so on, that in the future that's not going to be a problem when the contractors come to operate depopulation equipment, that they also come to do whatever else it is needed that we need done there to get us into disposal.
Thank you very much for that. I don't see any more written questions. Are there any other questions verbally? Not hearing any. I'd like to remind everyone that our next call is scheduled for December 13th, and we have Doris Olander on the roster to talk to us about anaerobic digestion and how it was used during 2015. So with that, I would like to thank you all for attending, and I look forward to speaking with you in December. That concludes our call.